Poker Copyright Mon is a series of games developed by Game Freak and Creatures Incorporated and published by Nintendo as part of the Poker Copyright Mon media franchise. First released in 1996 in Japan for the Game Boy, the main series of role-playing video games has continued on each generation of Nintendo's handhelds. Games are commonly released in pairs €1 each with slight variations €1, and then an enhanced remake of the games is released a few years from the original release. While the main series consists of role-playing games, spin-offs encompass other genres such as action role-playing, puzzle, and digital pet games. It is the second best-selling video game franchise worldwide, next to Nintendo's own Mario franchise. Generations. All of the licensed Poker Copyright Mon properties overseen by the Poker Copyright Mon Company are divided roughly by generation. These generations are roughly chronological divisions by release. When an official sequel in the main RPG series is released that features new Poker Copyright Mon characters and gameplay concepts, that sequel is considered the start of a new generation of the franchise. The main games and their spin-offs, the anime, manga and trading card game are all updated with the new Poker Copyright Mon properties each time a new generation begins. The franchise began its sixth generation with Poker Copyright Mon X and Y, which were released worldwide on October 12, 2013. First, the original Poker Copyright Mon games are Japanese role-playing video games with an element of strategy, and were created by Satoshi Tajiri for the Game Boy. These role-playing games, and their sequels, remakes, and English-language translations, are still considered the main Poker Copyright Mon games, and the games with which most fans of the series are familiar. The Poker Copyright Mon series began with the release of Pocket Monsters Red and Green for the Game Boy in Japan. When these games proved extremely popular, an enhanced blue version was released sometime after, and the blue version was reprogrammed as Poker Copyright Mon Red and Blue for international release. The original red and green versions were never released outside Japan. Afterwards, a second enhanced remake, Poker Copyright Mon Yellow, was released to use the color palette of the Game Boy Color and more of a stylistic resemblance to the popular Poker Copyright Mon anime. This first generation of games introduced the original 151 species of Poker Copyright Mon, as well as the basic game concepts of capturing, training, battling and trading Poker Copyright Mon with both computer and human players. These versions of the games take place within the fictional Kanto region, though the name Kanto was not used until the second generation. Spin-off first-generation titles include Poker Copyright Mon Pinball, an adaptation of the Poker Copyright Mon trading card game for Game Boy Color. An on-rails photography simulator for Nintendo 64 titled Poker Copyright Mon Snap. A Nintendo 64 Poker Copyright Mon themed adaptation of Tetris Attack, Poker Copyright Mon Puzzle League. A 3D Nintendo 64 incarnation of the handheld RPGs battle system, Poker Copyright Mon Stadium. And a co-starring role for several species in the Nintendo 64 fighting game Super Smash Bros. At the Nintendo Space World in 2000, a game was revealed briefly with Meowth and Team Rocket singing a song. This was one of the earliest introductions of the Poker Copyright Mon Togepi and Bellossom. This game was called Meowth's Party, but was never turned into a playable game. Instead, the song video was played at the end of one Poker Copyright Mon episode, and a CD was made for retail in Japan for a limited time. Second, the second generation of Poker Copyright Mon video games began in 1999 with the Japanese release of Poker Copyright Mon Gold and Silver for the Game Boy Color, with Australia and North America getting the game in October 2000 and European release date of April 2001. Like the previous generation, an enhanced remake titled Poker Copyright Mon Crystal was later released. This generation introduced 100 new species of Poker Copyright Mon, for a total of 251 Poker Copyright Mon to collect, train, and battle. New gameplay features include a day and night system which influences events in the game. Full use of the Game Boy Color's color palette. An improved interface and upgraded inventory system. Better balance in the collection of Poker Copyright Mon and their moves, statistics and equipable items. The addition of 2 new Poker Copyright Mon types to better balance the strengths and weaknesses of each Poker Copyright Mon. Poker Copyright Mon breeding. A new region named Johto and the ability to select the protagonist's gender. Unique to the second-generation games is the fact that, after exploring Johto, the player can enter and explore the original Kanto region, which lies to the east of Johto. Spin-off second-generation games include the Game Boy Color adaptation of Poker Copyright Mon Puzzle League, a puzzle game created by ZOPPF Industries made specifically for the Game Boy Color, Poker Copyright Mon Puzzle Challenge. A Nintendo 64 pet simulator, Heyu, Pikachu. The Poker Copyright Mon Stadium sequel, Poker Copyright Mon Stadium 2, for Nintendo 64. Several Poker Copyright Mon mini-games for the e-reader and a co-starring role for several Poker Copyright Mon species in the Super Smash Bros. Sequel Super Smash Bros. Melee for the Nintendo GameCube. The Poker Copyright Mon Mini was a handheld game console released in December 2001 in Japan and 2002 in Europe and North America. Third. Poker Copyright Mon entered its third generation with the 2002 release of Poker Copyright Mon Ruby and Sapphire for Game Boy Advance and continued with the Game Boy Advance remakes of Poker Copyright Mon Red and Green, Poker Copyright Mon Fire and Leaf Green. An enhanced remake of Poker Copyright Mon Ruby and Sapphire titled Poker Copyright Mon Emerald followed after. The third generation introduced 135 new Poker Copyright Mon for a total of 386 species. It also features a more visually detailed environment compared to previous games, natures, which affect Poker Copyright Mon stats, a new 2-on-2 Poker Copyright Mon battling mechanic, a special ability system applying to each Poker Copyright Mon in battle, the Poker Copyright Mon contest sub-game, and the new region of Hearn. However, this generation also garnered some criticism for leaving out several gameplay features, including the day and night system introduced in the previous generation, and it was also the first installment that encouraged the player to collect merely a selected assortment of the total number of Poker Copyright Mon rather than every existing species. Third-generation spin-off titles include Poker Copyright Mon Pinball, Ruby and Sapphire for Game Boy Advance. Poker Copyright Mon Mystery Dungeon, Blue Rescue Team and Red Rescue Team for Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS. Poker Copyright Mon Dash, Poker Copyright Mon Trezu. And Poker Copyright Mon Ranger for Nintendo DS. Poker Copyright Mon Channel and Poker Copyright Mon Box, Ruby and Sapphire for Nintendo GameCube. And 2 RPGs for the Nintendo GameCube, consisting of the games Poker Copyright Mon Colosseum and Poker Copyright Mon XD, Gale of Darkness. Fourth, in 2006, Japan began the fourth generation of the franchise with the release of Poker Copyright Mon Diamond and Pearl for Nintendo DS. The games were subsequently released in North America on April 22, 2007 and in Australia on June 21, 2007. The game was then later released in the UK and Europe on July 27, 2007. Other main series games in the fourth generation include Poker Copyright Mon Platinum, a director's cut version of Diamond and Pearl in the same vein as Poker Copyright Mon Yellow, Crystal, and Emerald. It was released for the Nintendo DS in Japan on September 13, 2008, in North America on March 22, 2009, and in Australia and Europe on May 14, 2009 and May 22, 2009 respectively. It was also announced that the Generation 2 games Poker Copyright Mon Gold and Silver would be remade for the Nintendo DS as Poker Copyright Mon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. First released in Japan on September 12, 2009, the games were later released to North America, Australia, and Europe during March 2010. The fourth generation introduces another 107 new species of Poker Copyright Mon, bringing the number of Poker Copyright Mon species to 493. This generation is the first to have 3D graphics in a main series game, although it is still a mixture of both 3D graphics and sprites. New gameplay concepts include a restructured move classification system, online multiplayer trading and battling via Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, the return of the second generation's day and night system, the expansion of the third generation's poker copyright Mon contests into super contests, and the new region of Sinnoh, which is an underground component for multiplayer gameplay in addition to the main overworld. Heart Gold and Soul Silver also introduced the Pukethalon to the Jita region, which consists of many poker copyright Mon-based sporting events making use of the stylus. Spin-off games in the fourth generation include the Poker Copyright Mon Stadium follow-up Poker Copyright Mon Battle Revolution for Wii, Poker Copyright Mon Ranger, Shadows of Almia and Poker Copyright Mon Ranger, Guardian Signs for Nintendo DS, Poker Copyright Mon Mystery Dungeon, Explorers of Time and Explorers of Darkness and their sister game, Explorers of Sky all for the Nintendo DS, and a co-starring role for Pikachu, Jigglypuff, Lucario, and a Poker Copyright Mon trainer in the 2008 Wii Fighter Super Smash Bros. Brawl. 5th, on January 29, 2010, the Poker Copyright Mon company announced that a new game was in development for the Nintendo DS to be released later that year. A silhouette of a new Poker Copyright Mon was shown by Junichi Masuda on February 7, 2010, episode of Poker Copyright Mon Sunday, stated to be in the upcoming film for the summer and to be identified in a future episode on February 21. This new character would also be featured in the March 2010 issue of CoroCoro comic available on February 15, and is the start of the fifth generation of the Poker Copyright Mon franchise. Since then, the character has been named Zorak, and its pre-evolution was also revealed to be named Zorua. Both were featured in Zorak, Master of Illusions. On April 9, 2010, the Japanese website updated with the titles of the versions as black and white, and announced a fall 2010 release date. The May 9, 2010 episode of Poker Copyright Mon Sunday displayed silhouettes of the three Poker Copyright Mon that are available for the player to choose from at the beginning of the game. These three Poker Copyright Mon were later revealed to be the Grass Snake Poker Copyright Mon Tsutaja, the Fire Pig Poker Copyright Mon Pokaboo, and the Sea Otter Poker Copyright Mon Mahimura. Other information revealed is that the game takes place in the Aizshu region, which was based on the New York City metropolitan area. Unlike other regions in the main series, another region's name is different in all languages the games are released in. For example, the German name is Einal, while the Italian name is Anima. On February 25, 2012, Junichi Masuda appeared on the Poker Copyright Mon Smash variety show to reveal the next titles in the main series of Poker Copyright Mon RPGs, Poker Copyright Mon Black 2 and Poker Copyright Mon White 2, which were ultimately released in Japan on June 23, 2012. The games serve as direct sequels to Black and White, featuring returning characters and several new characters and locations, with the legendary Poker Copyright Mon Kyurem in its new alternate form serving as the game's mascot. These two games were launched in Japan on September 18, 2010. This generation added a total of 156 Poker Copyright Mon to the games. The North American and European versions of the game were released on March 6 and 4, 2011, respectively. Poker Copyright Mon Rumble Blast, released in Japan on August 11, 2011, is a spin-off and sequel to Poker Copyright Mon Rumble, a Generation 4 spin-off game. It was released in North America and Europe on October 24 and December 2, 2011, respectively. At the December 17, 2011, Jump Festa event held by Shueisha, the crossover spin-off game Poker Copyright Mon plus Nobunaga's Ambition was announced for a March 17, 2012, release. The game uses the mechanics of the Nobunaga's Ambition series while utilizing the Poker Copyright Mon instead of human combatants in the turn-based combat game. At E3 2012, it was revealed that a fifth-generation Poker Copyright Mon mystery dungeon game, Gates to Infinity, would be released in Japan on November 23, 2012, and to the wider world by mid-2013. 6th, on December 24, 2012. Japanese magazine Nintendo Dream posted a greetings card sent out by Game Freak. In the card, Junichi Masuda exclaimed that during 2013, they intend to further evolve the world of Poker Copyright Mon. On December 29, 2012, a new Poker copyright Mon Black 2 and White 2 commercial aired in Japan, and ending with a message, informing Poker copyright Mon fans that the latest news would be announced on January 8, 2013. On January 4, 2013, both the Japanese and English official Poker copyright Mon website confirmed that an announcement will be made on January 8. On January 7, 2013, the official Japanese website explained that the Nintendo president, Satoru Iwata, will hold a 10-minute Poker copyright Mon direct video conference to announce the big Poker copyright Mon news. On January 8, 2013, Satoru Iwata announced the 6th generation of Poker copyright Mon, with the new paired games, Poker copyright Mon X and Y, which were released on the Nintendo 3DS on October 12, 2013 worldwide. The X and Y games are rendered in full 3D. However, only select parts of the game can be displayed in stereoscopic 3D. The video introduced the player characters, the starter Poker copyright Mon, Grass-type Spin, the Fire-type Fennekin, and the Water-type Froakie, and 2 other Poker copyright Mon, not named until later. A bird-like Poker copyright Mon called Yveltal having a shape similar to the letter Y, and a deer-like Poker copyright Mon called Xerneas with X shapes in its eyes. A month later, Sylvan, a new evolved form of Eevee belonging to the game's new fairy type, was revealed. On May 7, 2014, Nintendo revealed the game's Poker copyright Mon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire in a teaser trailer, remakes of the 3rd generation games Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire. They are slated for release worldwide in November 2014. Gameplay. One of the consistent aspects of most Poker copyright Mon games are spanning from Poker copyright Mon Red and Blue on the Game Boy to the Nintendo 3DS games Poker copyright Mon X and Y. Is the choice of one of 3 different Poker copyright Mon at the start of the player's adventures. These 3 are often labeled starter Poker copyright Mon. Players can choose a grass type, a fire type, or a water type, Poker copyright Mon indigenous to that particular region. For example, in Poker copyright Mon Red and Blue, the player has the choice of starting with Bulbasaur, Squirtle, or Charmander. The exception to this rule is Poker copyright Mon Yellow, where players are given a Pikachu, an electric-type mouse Poker copyright Mon, famous for being the mascot of the Poker copyright Mon media franchise. Unique to Poker copyright Mon Yellow, the 3-starter Poker copyright Mon from Red and Blue can be obtained during the quest by a single player. Another consistent aspect is that the player's rival will always choose the type that has a type advantage over the player's chosen Poker copyright Mon as his or her starter Poker copyright Mon. For instance, if the player picks the fire-type Charmander, the rival will always pick the water-type Squirtle. This does not affect the first battle between the rivals, as they can only use normal-type attacks at this point, meaning that they cannot exploit weaknesses. The exception to this is again Poker copyright Mon Yellow, in which the rival picks Eevee, a normal-type Poker copyright Mon with multiple evolutions. However, in Poker copyright Mon Black and White, there are 2 rivals. One picks the Poker copyright Mon with a type advantage over the player's chosen Poker copyright Mon, while the other chooses the Poker copyright Mon with a type disadvantage. In Poker copyright Mon Diamond, Pearl and Platinum, another trainer chooses the Poker copyright Mon with a type disadvantage to the player's chosen Poker copyright Mon, but never battles the player. Instead, this character battles alongside of the player as a tag partner in certain situations. The situation is similar in Poker copyright Mon X and Y, but there are 4 rivals. 2 of them receive the starter Poker copyright Mon in an arrangement similar to Poker copyright Mon Black and White, but the other 2 have completely different Poker copyright Mon. List of main Poker copyright Mon games. Handheld games, Generation I, Pocket Monsters, Red and Green, Pocket Monsters, Blue, Poker copyright Mon Red and Blue, Poker copyright Mon Yellow, Poker copyright Mon Trading Card Game. Generation II, Poker copyright Mon Gold and Silver, Poker copyright Mon Puzzle Challenge, Poker copyright Mon Crystal. Generation III, Game Boy Advance, Poker copyright Mon Ruby and Sapphire, Poker copyright Mon Fire and Leaf Green, Poker Copyright Mon Emerald, Poker Copyright Mon Mystery Dungeon, Red Rescue Team. Nintendo DS, Poker Copyright Mon Mystery Dungeon, Blue Rescue Team, Poker Copyright Mon Dash, Poker Copyright Mon Trezor. Poker Copyright Mon Ranger. Generation 4, Poker Copyright Mon Diamond and Pearl, Poker Copyright Mon Mystery Dungeon, Explorers of Time and Explorers of Darkness, Poker Copyright Mon Ranger, Shadows of Almia, Poker Copyright Mon Platinum, Poker Copyright Mon Mystery Dungeon, Explorers of Sky, Poker Copyright Mon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Poker Copyright Mon Ranger, Guardian Signs. Generation V, Nintendo DS, Poker Copyright Mon Black and White, Len with Poker Copyright Mon, Typing Adventure, Poker Copyright Mon Conquest, Poker Copyright Mon Black 2 and White 2. Nintendo 3DS, Poker Copyright Mon Rumble Blast, Poker Copyright Mon Mystery Dungeon, Gates to Infinity. Generation 6, Poker Copyright Mon X and Y, Poker Copyright Mon Amiga Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Console games, Generation I Poker Copyright Mon Stadium, Poker Copyright Mon Stadium, Poker Copyright Mon Snap, Poker Copyright Mon Puzzle League, Heyu, Pikachu. Generation 2, Poker Copyright Mon Stadium 2. Generation 3, Poker Copyright Mon Coliseum, Poker Copyright Mon Box, Ruby and Sapphire, Poker Copyright Mon Channel, Poker Copyright Mon XD, Gale of Darkness. Generation 4, Poker Copyright Mon Battle Revolution, My Poker Copyright Mon Ranch, Poker Copyright Mon Rumble, Poker Copyright Parkway, Pikachu's Adventure. Generation V Poker Copyright Park 2, Wonders Beyond, Poker Copyright Mon Rumble U. Appearances in other games, in the Super Smash Bros. Series, Pikachu, Ivysaur, Squirtle, Charizard, Jigglypuff, Pissue, Mewtwo and Lucario are playable characters. Pikachu and Jigglypuff are introduced in Super Smash Bros., and are also featured in Super Smash Bros. Melee for the Nintendo GameCube, alongside Pissue and Mewtwo. In Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Mewtwo and Pissue are not featured as playable characters, although Squirtle, Ivysaur, and Charizard make their first playable appearances as part of the Poker Copyright Mon trainer character, while Lucario appears as a separate character. Rayquaza is also featured as a boss enemy. The series also features Poker Copyright Balls as items, which, when used by a player, make a random Poker Copyright Mon appear, including Piplup, Bansley, and Munchlax, with various effects on the game. Furthermore, several Poker Copyright Mon computer games were released for Windows and Macintosh. Poker Copyright Mon were also in Mario Artist Paint Studio for Nintendo 64 as pastable stickers. Reception and legacy. The series has sold over 245 million units as of March 31, 2013, making this game one of the best-selling of all time. Guinness World Records awarded the Poker Copyright Mon Series 8 records in Guinness World Records, Gamers Edition 2008, including most successful RPG series of all time, Games series with the most spin-off movies, and most photosensitive epileptic seizures caused by a TV show. IGN ranked Poker Copyright Mon as the 17th greatest game series of all time, claiming that the basic gameplay premise boasts solid, addictive play mechanics, and several of the handheld RPGs deserve to be in every gamer's collection. Games Radar listed Poker Copyright Mon as the #1 Nintendo game not made by Nintendo, stating that having to catch them all made the games addictive. References